Hi Carolyn, are you ready to start these dialogues in Chorlton?
Yes.
Perfect, that's great. So let's start from the beginning, and I would like to know a little bit more about you in general. So my first question is, who are you? But not in the philosophical way. So how do you describe yourself, or what do you do?
In relation to
Chorlton Arts Festival, personal life. So let's say, how do you describe us as a human?
Okay, as a human. Whoa.
Yeah, not easy.
Well, I'll stick to describing myself in terms of professional and semi-professional kinds of activities.
Yes.
So my background is I'm a community psychologist and a counselling psychologist and a social worker. So those three things combined means that I'm interested in well-being and in community and community building. So most of my professional life before I retired was working at the Metropolitan University, where I taught community psychology and other subjects, and ran a research institute for health and social change, where we had quite a lot of different kinds of projects, all interdisciplinary. But one of the themes was around arts for health and well-being. And that involved working with artists and working with community groups around that topic, really, arts and for health and well-being.
And for how many years did you have that kind of project?
For those projects, probably for about 15, 16 years.
Yeah.
And we worked all over the Northwest with community arts projects and also internationally. So I worked with colleagues in Mexico and in Brazil and in Spain around community arts projects, but also in some African countries we had some arts-based projects all around arts for social change and for personal well-being. So there's always been a mixture of what art does for you as an individual artist or an individual audience member, but also what it does for the community and for groups getting together in ways that they might not otherwise get together.
Yeah, exactly. And when I started to prepare that conversation, I went to Google, and the first surprise for me is that you are in Wikipedia. So for me, like, wow, it's great.
Wikipedia, yes.
Wikipedia. Then I saw that you are a scholar activist. Then you are in the academia, as you say, psychology. But why, or how did you start to be interested in art? Was because I could lucky start one project. How was that process? Because you are in one side that is related, but why did you finish in the art?
So short of giving my entire life history,
yes,
which I could do on another occasion, my degrees are in psychology and in social psychology, and my research is all about the way in which the context, the immediate environment, but also the wider social context affects people's behaviour and their interactions with other people and their sense of who they are.
Yeah.
And that's led me through a number of different kinds of research over the years. It's led me to be doing research that is always about doing something as well as investigating something. So in the academic world we'd call that action research, or participatory action research for those bits of research and activity that involve the people who are affected by the research in the planning and the taking part of the research. So participatory action research, which is very well known in Latin America, but not so well known in the UK, and some other kinds of critical community psychologies, again, that are very well known in Latin America and in other parts of the world, particularly in the global south, but not so well known in the UK, have all informed the kinds of approach to research, but also the topics of research that I do. So over the years that's changed. It hasn't always been about arts. It's been about working with disabled people, about what makes things better for their lives, for people with intellectual impairments and their families, about how to reconstruct services so that they are better able to meet people's needs, whilst keeping people very well embedded in their local communities and in their communities of interest, because not all community has to be understood by locality.
Yes.
It could be about, so if you're interested in photography, well, there's a photographic community across Manchester and Greater Manchester, and indeed internationally, that would be important to be a part of.
Okay. Perfect. Now, this one open a couple of questions. I think with the pandemic, we have started to change our behavior. All the mental health now is, let's say, an issue and a big topic. So 2 questions here. What are the changes that you can see after COVID, after on the pandemic? And the second one, if you drill down about Chorlton, what are the main challenges that we have as a community in order to improve our well-being?
Specifically related to the pandemic for the second part?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. What changes did you see previously with pandemic?
I think that's actually a very complex question and has quite a complex answer, but there's some simple answers as well. So what the pandemic revealed, both in Chorlton but also elsewhere, was the growth of mutual aid groups. Mutual aid groups have always existed, they're not a new thing.
Yes.
What was new in Chorlton, I think I'm going to have to confuse the 2 questions, but what was new in Chorlton was the linking up of the mutual aid groups. So there's often been residence groups or home watch groups or parent teachers association or whatever, all sorts of mutual aids groups, but they've not necessarily been connected. And what in the pandemic, in Chorlton, the Chorlton Connectors group did was link up those mutual aid groups, and indeed that happened elsewhere as well. What the pandemic also did, and I'll come to mental health in a minute, but what the pandemic also did was show different ways in which people could support other people. So neighbours getting together to sing. There wasn't a whole lot of that going on before the pandemic. There was during the pandemic, and I don't really have a sense how much has continued, but some things have continued. The Chorlton bike deliveries, for example, was something when people couldn't get out and do their own shopping. They were sort of confined to home. That grew up as a way of local people initially volunteering to support other people in doing home deliveries, and to keep, but importantly also to help maintain traders' activities during the pandemic. I don't think you can separate mental health from the wider context, because my whole orientation is about context rather than individuals. But clearly some of the social isolation aspects of the pandemic have affected people negatively, but I do have to say it's also some people benefited from that. Some people engaged in home-based projects and hobbies and so on that they hadn't done before. Young people, again, it's dual-edged. For a lot of young people, it was very difficult not being in school, not being, or being at home. And for others, they quite enjoyed it. Of course, the people who are the most deleteriously affected are the people who have a number of different difficulties in their lives. So people living poverty, people already living with mental health issues, very few of those people would have benefited from anything to do with the confinements and the fear and the anxiety engendered by the pandemic. But mental health is is always affected by social circumstances and but family, but also wider family and also more societal
and then all the economical context.
And the economic context, exactly. If you don't have any money to buy your next food, or you can't afford data on your phone, the isolation of the pandemic and the fear for the pandemic was multiplied enormously.
Exactly. And now, after the pandemic, what are the main challenges you see in order to build community, or the big challenge that the community has here in Chorlton?
I'm not sure that they exist specifically as being after the pandemic. So some of them run through from before the pandemic. There are some really good things in Chorlton that have happened to continue some of the good things that happened in the pandemic. So there was, from the, there was a question about how to continue the benefits of connecting the connectors. And so there was a series of Zoom meetings and discussions called Let's Reimagine Our Chorlton. Now, they weren't terribly widely attended, although they went up and down in terms of they attended these meetings, but they spawned a number of initiatives. So one initiative was the Our Green Chorlton map,
Okay.
which was a map of the green spaces in Chorlton that was delivered by volunteers to every household in Chorlton.
I have one, to be honest.
And we have them still left around the place. Another one was from the Reimagine. There was let me get this right. I don't know what's based in what. But there's an initiative that is still carrying on called Chorlton Community Co-op,
Okay.
which is again a group of people getting together to create an umbrella co-op to support the developments of other co-ops. Given that Chorlton has a number of worker cooperatives, but other cooperative type ventures like the Arts Festival, which isn't a formal co-op but is run on cooperative principles. But then there's other things that preceded the pandemic. So before the pandemic, we had initiatives to try and get groups that were interested in place together, and we formed a thing called the Chorlton Alliance, which was a place where people could come together and share information about what was happening in Chorlton. That fed into another initiative that was taking place called the Chorlton Vision, and that was a group of people working participatively, trying to work with all sorts of different groups across Chorlton, see what do you want in the way of Chorlton, what needs to change in the way of Chorlton, mostly to do with place.
Yes, yes.
And the physical aspects of Chorlton, but also the social aspects came into it. And that led to a document called the Chorlton Vision. What
are the 3-5 highlights that you saw in that document? Or that you discovered that people need?
Yes, there's a website and it's publicly available, and we've been talking to the council about.
But what specific actions, the highlights?
Well, there are things like repairing the pavements,
okay.
like having street art, like having developments that are sympathetic to the area. So when there's building, that they're sympathetic. So it's got to focus on the commercial centre of Chorlton. Of course, there's a much wider area of Chorlton. But that's one of the initiatives. And then the last thing I'll mention, which I've forgotten what it is now. What was the last thing I was going to mention? Again, it preceded the pandemic, but was being picked up by people primarily on the Let's Reimagine Chorlton discussions.
Yes.
So people get to know each other through those discussions. And that's the Chorlton Get Together, where Wilbraham Road from the Four Banks, which doesn't have banks anymore, up to the Lloyd's Hotel, the road is closed and community groups put on stalls or activities, and on a Sunday in either in June, July or September, it depends when we can actually get it going. But that's happened now twice since the pandemic. It happened once before the pandemic, but I think it was the networks and the relationships that people formed through the different activities of the pandemic that maybe enabled the get-togethers that happened after the pandemic to actually go ahead. So of course, it's a moot question whether they'd have gone ahead without the pandemic. Maybe they would.
Yeah, and now if I correct, you was born in Kent and then you live in London, Oxford. Mm-hmm. What do you say about Chorlton, about Manchester? What do you like about Manchester? For how long have you been here? What do you think that is special here in our neighbourhood?
I think Manchester, I've been in Manchester since 1976. So I've lived here longer than I've lived anywhere else. And of course it's changed massively over that period. I didn't initially live in Chorlton, I initially lived in Old Trafford. Yeah. But when I had children, I didn't want them being educated in a selective schooling system, so I moved a mile and a half away into Chorlton, which was quite an ordinary kind of mixed neighbourhood at that time. It certainly wasn't as an expensive place to live as it is now. And over the years, involved in things in the city centre, but also across Manchester and Greater Manchester, in lots of different ways. I think Manchester is a stimulating place because it is so varied. And I know there's a huge emphasis on the Tony Wilson and post-Tony Wilson creative music scene. But the music scene in Manchester predates Tony Wilson and all of the factory records things. There was a really lively music club-based scene in the 1970s. And a lively jazz scene. There's always been a jazz scene and a theatre scene. And when I moved to Manchester and friends used to come and visit me, they used to say, well, it's a bit like London, but everything's within walking distance. So it had all even then, when there was, the city centre was more or less closed on at 5:30 on a Friday night. There wasn't much going on except in the clubs and bars and so on. But even then, it had such a varied cultural life, as well as being progressive in terms of political solidarity groups. So the Nicaraguan Solidarity Group, the Cuban Solidarity Group, which I chaired for many years. It was all extremely lively in Manchester, which made it a stimulating place to live in and to be young in, and differently to have a family in. Because I think, certainly in my case, my engagement with the city and with the neighbourhood has changed over the different life stages. So it's different when you have a family from when you are single.
And why is still attractive nowadays for you, Manchester and Chorlton?
I don't really know, other than inertia, and this is where I live. I think it still retains those characteristics. I think it's a friendly place. Yes. Often, when I say it's a friendly place, I'm not sort of buying into some kind of romantic notions of Northerners are all friendly. But one of the things that was very noticeable when I moved up from the south was people would talk to you at bus stops. Yeah. People would talk to you in queues or in places where, pubs maybe, whereas where I lived before they wouldn't necessarily unless they knew you. So that kind of superficial friendliness still exists, I think. And it's not particular to Manchester, many places are like that, and particularly big cities are often like that. But they can also be alienating, and in just the same way that other cities can be alienating, so can Manchester and so can Chorlton. Yeah. So although there's lots of things going on in both places, the city and the neighbourhood, it's not always easy for people to get involved. And one of the reasons for that is a sort of paradoxical thing. If there's a very successful group or activity going on, it's almost like it's got a big skin round it. Yeah. that people, it might not be real in any sense, but people who are outside that skin think, oh, I can't get involved in that because all of those people inside is what they do. It's what they do. And that is a challenge for community groups about how to be open and welcoming and accepting of all sorts of different people, but also how to make sure that all those different people know that it's possible.
And the other question, and this one is related with, let's say, with the city, with the neighborhood, but the same with the stage. Now that you are in the retirement, how do you maintain this activism and this optimism? I can see you that you are in the bike and you are talking with the venues and you are leading a lot of different organizations. How to obtain and how to keep moving? So what is the advice?
What do you mean, keep moving? What makes me keep doing it?
Exactly.
Two things, I think. One is I'm quite extrovert and I like talking to people, and in social psychology there's a concept called what's it called now? The strength of weak ties. So that's the whole thing, that to feel connected and to feel a part of something, you don't need to have deep, intimate relationships with other people all the time. Yeah. So the relatively superficial but constant relationships. So meeting people, so you talked about venues, talking to venue hosts. So maybe talking to people 3 or 4 times a year is a weak tie, but put them all together and you've got a whole web of weak ties that mean you feel a part of the community. So I think it's that, but there's also an interest in community building. So it's very difficult to separate my academic work from my community work, which is why the concept of scholar activist, is quite a relevant one, although now it would probably be more activist scholar, because I don't do much academic work. But it's, there are always choices. So take the Arts Festival, for example. There's always choices about how to run an arts festival. And in the back of my mind of all these things is there a way of doing whatever the activity is in a way that also contributes to strengthening and building community, building relationships between people and between groups, and strengthening the pride that we all have in the place or the interests that we belong to.
Great. And if you see to the, let's say, to the past and all the journey that you have, do you have some, or can you share with us some specific moments of experiences that happened with you and create the person that you are today? Some specific, I don't know, in your childhood or something in the academies, something that makes you change and be so interested in the people, in the communities, in art, and create all this activism.
I did notice of that question, I think. I can refer you to some articles that I've written about this, but what can I think of straight away? Oh gosh. In the 1970s, early 1970s, I was a student in London. Yeah. And at that time, the docklands in London hadn't been developed. It was rundown housing, slum housing, boarded up housing and so on. And one of the things, I think it was probably an organisation like Christian Aid, did what was then the first counting of people who were sleeping rough. And so we joined in the activity, a group of us, and we were going around all this Dockland area, derelict buildings, and going into them to see if anybody was asleep or sleeping rough. And of course there were, and it's quite a different rough sleeping population from the people that are rough sleeping now, I think. But nevertheless, it was it was an insight into how people manage to survive despite multiple difficulties, and in a society that is disabling and although in some ways post-war Britain has always had some kind of a social security safety net, there are always people that fall through it. And that plus my experience when I left school of working in what was then an approved school, which is it's not quite, it's part of the criminal justice system, but it's not, it's the step before you go into like a youth justice, youth offender institution at that time called Borstal, or a prison. So this was for young women who were mostly committed by the courts, but for non-indictable crimes. So for being in need of care and protection was a big thing. A court could deem a teenage girl is in need of care and protection and basically send her to a secure institution. And although she hadn't committed a crime, if she ran away from that place, she had. And again, that was another example of people for whom safety nets don't work. So there's always spaces and always gaps. And it's those kinds of experiences, I think, that led me to think, well, plus kind of some political education groups that I was in at the time, but it's more the practical things that say, well, a bit like community activity, in any kind of research or work, there are always choices about how do you do it, who do you involve. So mental health, take that as an example. You could work with people with flying phobias. So those are people who've had money to fly, but just are scared of flying. Or you could work with people who have no money and nowhere to live and disabling physical conditions and who are really struggling. And so there are kind of choices. Now those are two extreme examples, but the choices then for me were always to see where there were niches to work with the people at the end of multiple disadvantage, who are often, well, nearly always, extremely strong psychologically people. They have to be to get by. But again, it's about sort of what needs to change in their circumstances and how can that be achieved, whether it's through social policies or through service development or whatever it is, so that their lives are better for them.
Clear. Now, if we move a little bit and we go to the Chorlton Arts Festival, to be more specific, you are the chair for the Chorlton Arts Festival. So tell us a little bit about the identity about the festival and the ethos that we are trying to build about the festival.
Okay, so I'm only chair of the Arts Festival because I chair the Civic Society. And the Arts Festival's been going since 2002. We've been running the Arts Festivals, and it's had various groups running it over the years, and we've been running it since 2019. And, well, I say I'm only the chair because I chair the Civic Society. It's also that I have an interest, as I've said, in arts and community building and well-being. So it was a good opportunity to think, well, okay, we could do this, and we could do it in a way, not just me, with colleagues, do it in a way that was explicitly about community building as well as artistic exhibitions or performances. So we decided very early on that we'd do it through voluntary activity, and that we wouldn't do it through money exchange and payments. And of course there's a case to be made, a very strong case to be made to say, well, you can run an arts festival by getting grants and large amounts of money and paying all the people who participate, And you could get someone from Cornwall coming up and doing their thing and then going back to Cornwall. Well, take that as an example. Somebody from Cornwall comes up, does their thing, goes back to Cornwall. Maybe people pay to go and see them. So the artist takes the money that they got back to Cornwall, and the expertise and the relationships that they built and the money during that involvement doesn't stay in Chorlton. So whilst it's a perfect legitimate way to involve people in an arts festival, it doesn't contribute in quite the same way to community building, or to kind of one of the things that we think about in terms of this is to the cultural vitality of the neighbourhood. So we decided that we'd do it, everyone would be volunteers. So the organisers would be volunteers, we wouldn't have a paid director, we wouldn't have a paid anybody, artists wouldn't be paid, venues wouldn't be paid. So everybody would be doing it voluntarily. It would be located in community venues, partly because if they are, say, a pub or a cafe, then that contributes to their reputation, but also to their footfall, possibly. We have to be careful about it not being over-claiming the benefits of the activities. But if they didn't take place in community venues, then there couldn't be any increase in footfall as apart from due to the arts festival. So that's the ethos very much, that it's about sharing, and it's about sharing your talents and your interests, about sharing your community places. We also decided we wouldn't have fees for audiences. And again, this is something that we discuss it every year, and there's a good case to be made that we should charge people to attend these events. But then when you think about it, so one of the things that's often said is, oh, you could charge £5, it's only or £3.50, it's the price of a cup of coffee. But it might be the price of a cup of coffee. But by the time you've got 4 people in your family or your household, it's a lot more than the price of 1 cup of coffee. And if you wanted to go to 4 different things in the arts festival, it's a lot more than 1 price of coffee. So we decided that we would keep charges to a minimal. So we don't have any set fees and charges for attendance. If an artist does need to cover their expenses, then they can charge, and then that's advertised along with their event. But that's very much the ethos. It's about trying to be as inclusive as possible and trying to work in ways that that lead to community building, community connections, whilst also being an arts festival. And another important reason for this, and this is another strand of activities that I'm involved in, is we're going to have to get used to a different way of doing things. Climate change is driving all sorts of questions about how the economy works. And part of the thinking about what's called a post-growth future is away from economic growth, where every transaction is a monetized transaction and people are making profit, as whether it's personal profit or company profit, from all activity. That's a bit of a caricature, but moving away from that to being more of a sharing economy, a sharing and a relationship-based economy that is primarily local, where money is kept local, people shop local, they exchange things local, not necessarily for money. And so this is kind of prefiguring, if you like, a post-growth possibility of, in the arts sector, of sharing and appreciating effort and talent and place in a locality.
And what do you think that is the role of art in the community? why art is important? What do you think that give us the art?
Yeah, enormously varied. Because you can look at it from the artist's point of view, you can look at it from the venue's point of view, you can look at it from the audience's point of view, or all three together. And if you looked, well, either the artist or the audience, if you took either of those things, you could frame it in terms of enhancing well-being. It's about noticing things that are different. It's about giving of your talent and your expertise. It's about connecting with other people. It's about enjoyment and fun. It can also make you think about different things, think about things that you've never thought of before. And that could be a benefit for both the artists and the participants. For artists as well, we know that some of them, it's a good launch pad for getting on professionally. So some visual artists have gone on to create exhibitions and to hire studio space and sell their work when their first exhibition was in the Arts Festival. Other musicians, some of them have enhanced their reputation and got gigs, paid gigs elsewhere because of the Arts Festival. So we know that from the feedback that we've been given. I'm not saying that every artist has suddenly developed into a fully blown professional artist able to make a living from their talents, but some have.
Oh, great.
And for venues, it's twofold. It's one, being seen to be a part of something, and that has reputational advantage. So it's a good thing for bars, cafes, shops to participate in, because it shows that they have an interest in the neighbourhood in ways beyond their own trade. But it also, as I said before, it also for some places might increase footfall. We know from feedback that some places would say that they definitely had an increased footfall from their events for the Arts Festival. We don't know that for everyone, but for some it is the case.
Oh, that's great. And in my case, one of the things that I can see with Chorlton Arts Festival is that possibility to live in one place with the environment that supports you in order to create art. And now that I have a child, I think it's important that you start to see different aesthetics, different conversations, that something is happening, and this happening, he can see that it could be for babies, for kids, for young people. Sometimes it's in the street, or you go to the venue or the restaurant that you normally go, and it's normal, and during that week or couple of weeks, the kids, they can see a different art, different expression. And I think when you are surrounded by that kind of environment and that kind of people, it is really great. And I think this one is something different in Chorlton, this kind of experience.
Yeah, I think it's not just Chorlton. There are other neighbourhoods that are really strong on creativity. And one of the things we lack in Chorlton is a base. So we've got the Edge Theatre, which does some wonderful stuff, but we don't have a base for people just meeting and getting together and do creative activities. So various workshops are put on by different groups and so on, which are fantastic, but they're always spread out. There's no real kind of
consolidation.
Well, there's no location where people say, oh, if I go there, I'm going to meet someone interesting who's a creative, and I can sit and not spend money and just talk to them and maybe make myself a coffee or share a cup of tea with them. We don't have anything like that in Chorlton.
Great.
But the other thing is that atmosphere that you described isn't just due to the Arts Festival. It's all the different things that are going on. Yeah. So there's a book festival, there's a beer festival, there's the schools put on all sorts of different programmes throughout the year. So do other groups. Some of the churches have cultural programmes, concerts and so on going on throughout the year. So it's not...
So that is just a part about the whole community that is working the whole year in order to influence the community. Great. Now, looking ahead, what are the plans that we have for this 24 for Chorlton Arts Festival?
Well,
is something new, something that we are preparing about it?
Well, it's difficult about something new because we review the Arts Festival every year and we write a report that's publicly available on the website. And it's quite clear that the way it works at the moment is very positive for people.
Yeah.
One or two people that would rather it was done differently, but on the whole it's mostly a positive experience for people. So this year I can announce that it will be between the 17th and the 26th of May, which is quite a good time to have the Arts Festival. It's where we've had it for a number of years, and where the time where it started, we changed it during pandemic and post-pandemic, because places weren't going to be open. So to be in May, we're hoping the sign up for artists to participate, which is entirely voluntary, is open now, so people can go to the website until February the 18th and sign up and say they want to participate. What we try and do every year, unsuccessfully since we've been running it, is to get more classical music involved. So we're trying to do that again this year. And we're trying to link more explicitly with some of the youth projects that are around, not directly with young people, but through the projects that already exist, like Unity Arts, like Young Identity, and so on. And yeah, I think that's probably. I'm trying to make sure that that everybody. We'd like to get to the position where nobody in Chorlton or nearby could say, "Oh, didn't know that was happening." So that's a really tricky thing. It's about trying to identify, well, what are the sub-communities and sub-groupings in Chorlton, and how are we sure that our information gets to them? And one thing that we know is, because most of the interaction with the Arts Festival takes place on the website, and through the website, that's really difficult for people who don't use the internet or can't afford data. So how can our question is, how can we make sure that those people also get an opportunity to take part, but also to attend? And they can't attend if they don't know it's happening.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's great. And another question. You had been involved about art, about community building. So, what is your advice to these young people that is looking to engage with art or community?
What's my advice to them?
Yeah, any advice?
Oh, well, start getting involved in the Chorlton Arts Festival, without a doubt. Well, interesting, somewhat ironically, young people get lots of opportunities through school.
Yeah.
Not through youth projects so much now, because there aren't so many, but certainly through school, to engage in lots of different kinds of art. And schools put on really good programmes as part of the Arts Festival. But what we would say is that if people wanted to take part in events in the Arts Festival outside of whatever's going on in school or college, they can apply directly. If they're under, I can't remember if it's 16 or 18, they'd need to have parental or carer permission, but they don't feel that it's not for them. So last year, for example, we had a group of young people doing K-pop dance in Chorlton Park. Not through a school or a college, but on their own back. So that's an example of the way young people can take part without having to, not only going through their programmes in schools and colleges, but of course we still want the schools and colleges to to put on their programmes throughout the Arts Festival. Yeah.
Okay. No.
But in terms of career development, I couldn't possibly advise them.
Okay, no, that's great. So I think, it's great to have the conversation with you, all this dialogue. I think it's really important to build community. I have a final question, and it's what question will you ask to yourself?
What question would I ask myself?
Yes.
In relation to what?
To this.
How long will you keep doing it for?
Okay, don't answer. I hope to a lot of years, but yeah, it's a good question.
And that's kind of a serious question, because when I said that everybody, including the organisers, is a volunteer, the number of hours taken to organise the festival is enormous.
Yeah.
And it's quite interesting. Every year we fill in the, I can't remember what it's called, cultural activities census programme thing for the city council. And one of their questions is how many volunteers are involved, or how many volunteer hours. They asked two questions: how many volunteers and how many volunteer hours. And well, last year during the festival itself we had 24 volunteers, which is quite a lot. But in the run-up, there's a lot more than that. And when I reported that we have over 2,000 volunteer hours, they came back and said, "Did you mean that?" And I said, "Yes, we do mean that, and it's probably a lot more than that." It is very time-consuming, which is, I think everybody in the organising committee is still committed to doing it in the way that we're doing it, but it would be an awful lot easier to do it if we just paid a director. That would be the easy way to do it, but there's no certainty that a paid director would do it. You'd have to leave them to use their artistic talents in the way that they want, and we can't be sure that they would. And we can't be sure that they'd. The other thing I haven't mentioned is that they would anchor the Arts Festival in sponsorship from local organisations. So we do have some costs, all publicity, or nearly all publicity costs, and we pay for those through sponsorship from local businesses and organisations. And we have support from some key creative people as patrons, all with a local connection, which is fantastic really. And that's all about this kind of web of connections that is linked to community building.
Perfect. Great. So these are all the questions
Well,
for today. Thank you very much for your time
Yeah.
and for all the conversation.
Yeah.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.